All right, we're going to start talking about research designs and psychology. Research designs basically says it's a plan for how to conduct a study. Within each study, we're going to look at variables. Variables are sometimes referred to as constructs as well, psychological constructs or variables. And what variables is meant to mean is that anything that changes or varies among different variables. So for example, if we were looking at aggression, for example, are there different degrees of aggression? And that's the point. It would be a variable that we could observe and also measure. And as a result of that, not everybody's going to have the same level or degree of aggression. There'll be different degrees in which we look at that variable when we measure it. And then we're going to look at a population. The population of interest is the entire group a researcher interested in. So the example that they provide here is all humans, all adolescents, all boys, all girls, all college students. When you're running a study, you want to be specific on the population that you're studying. And you're not going to be able to study every single person in that population because it could be very expensive to try to do so. So for example, in the study that I conducted, I wanted a population of male and female in the United States, not abroad, and they needed to be between the age of 20 and age 60. That was my population. So if anybody participated in the study that was under the age of 20, they were eliminated. Anybody over the age of 60, they were eliminated. If they were from a different country, they were removed as well, because I was focusing on the population that I was interested in. And that's what you'll do as a social scientist. Now, I will not be able to study every person between the age of 20 and 60, male and female, in the United States. You can imagine how expensive that would be to conduct. So then you're going to look for a subset of the population or a sample. And this is a portion of the population that we can actually observe. And once you meet the G power, in other words, how many people you would need statistically to satisfy that sample, that's what you would focus on. On my sample, it only required 53 individuals or respondents for me to conduct my research. But it is very common when people conduct research that they go over and above what the statistical formula in the G power actually suggests. So you'll find studies where it's 200, 250, or 1,000. They're also very expensive to run. Therefore, you're going to have to start to rely on grant funding to finance your research projects because it can be very expensive. And we want to make sure that the sample is representative and it's accurately representing the population that we're focused on. So here's an example. And this could be kind of difficult to try to understand, but it says here that the sampling is the procedure researchers use to obtain participants from a population. Now let's just say that the population that we want to sample is 2,200. And each of these circles filled with people represents 100 people, giving us the total of 2,200. Now, if we're looking at a representative sample, we need to make sure that, as an example with this study, is that if we wanted 27% of the population to come from the green population, then it would fit here, 41% from the orange, and so forth. But let's just say that the sample that we're sampling actually turns out to be 44% instead of 27. It now means that the sample size, or the sample of the population, is unrepresentative and we can't use it. Now we have different types of studies, descriptive, case studies. Descriptive studies are describing very specific characteristics that the researcher is trying to define. So here it says they're trying to define a problem and a variable of interest, but makes no prediction and does not control or manipulate anything. They're just observing and they're describing what they see. And here, let's just use aggression as another example. Well, what does it mean to be aggressive? Everyone in here has a different version of what aggression might look like. But your version of aggression might not be the type of aggression that a social scientist is trying to observe and measure. As a result of that, they're going to have to use behavioral coders that are going to have to observe people and describe what they're doing, and that coder has to accurately describe when they observe aggression. But aggression has to be defined, it has to be operationalized, and then it has to be recorded when it's observed. Now with a case study is going to focus on individuals, and it's usually one person that they observe over a period of time. They give a couple of examples in the book, and the examples that they use in the book, and what I've traditionally used in the past, is a case study of a said serial killer. But we have to be mindful that not all case studies can be generalized across a wider population, right? Because our population doesn't have that many serial killers. But when there is one that is in your zip code or one that becomes known, you know they tend to create a lot of damage in the process. But an example that they provide with case studies has to do with greatness, creativity, genius, and also evil. So a greatness example would be a case study on Abraham Lincoln is what they use in the book. When it comes to creativity, Van Gogh, you could even put Pablo Picasso in that, or Caravaggio, for example, to understand why they were so creative. And let's not forget about Leonardo da Vinci, right? And then when we look at genius, we have two scientists that they bring up, Albert Einstein, and for creating theory of relativity, which revised Newton's work on physics 200 years or just over 200 years later. And then we also have, I believe she was Polish, but she married a Frenchman, and they did a lot of remarkable things in physics. Her name was Maria Curie. And she created and published her findings on both radium and polonium. Now that's important because polonium is very destructive, but radium becomes very useful in presenting a cure for some cancers. And it's also one of the reasons why her health deteriorated, because she didn't know that radium and polonium was destructive. And radium glows. And it was very common in Paris where they marketed radium and they put it into makeup. So women were wearing makeup with radium in it, and they were glowing at night at clubs and jazz bars and stuff like that. And over a relatively short period of time, they got very sick, their hair started falling out, and they actually died. They also used radium in their bedrooms where it acted as an artificial nightlight. And what they thought would be good turned out to be very poisonous. And her husband, a Frenchman, he was run over by a carriage and a horse because he was disoriented crossing the street because he was affected by radium and polonium. And he was dying relatively fast because of the exposure to it. But that's how his ending went. And Maria Curie eventually died as well. But she, I believe, earned 2 Nobel Prizes, whereas Albert Einstein earned 1. And let's not forget about evil. It mentions Hitler, but it's not just Hitler that I'm thinking about. In the 20th century, both Hitler and Stalin lived at the same time. And Hitler is responsible just with the death camps and Holocaust camps of approximately 11 million people, and there's probably more in excess of that. That would be a good and interesting case study. But also with Joseph Stalin, we often discount him. In between 1930 and 1955, the gulags, which was a Soviet Union workers' camp, in short, a death camp, is responsible for the lives of 20 million people that they know of from the gulags. And it started in 1930. Hitler's Dachau camp, which was originally for political dissenters or political opponents, started, I believe, in 1933. I do think it's likely that he got the idea of his death camps because of Joseph Stalin's gulags. And if anybody wants to read a very long book, I didn't read it, but I did listen to it on Audible, and I think it's over 20 hours in length. There's an individual by the name of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and he writes the Gulag Archipelago. And it's a very straightforward and transparent book, very dense, but it's actually very interesting to listen to, and I suspect read, because he was in these camps, and some of the torture that he went through and what other people went through is remarkable. And over 20 million people have lost their lives in the gulags. But I think the reason I bring up Stalin outside the context of what they bring here in case studies is I think his gulags was the inspiration behind the death camps that we now call the Holocaust. Quite interesting. But this would be a great example of doing a case study, because if you were working in security intelligence, for example, might case studies on foreign leaders that have the capacity for such great evil be worthy of a study, a deep, in-depth study of their background and their psychology to better understand what the risks are associated to humankind if they continue to harness the power that they have in their office? What might society and the world look like at that point? Well, turning to World War II gives us some insight. And the gulags didn't end until 1955, 2 years after Joseph Stalin supposedly died. But there is belief that Khrushchev actually assassinated him. Whether or not that's true or not, he passed in 1953, 1955, the gulags ended, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn was released, and he then wrote about his experience in the death camp called the Gulag. The Gulag Archipelago. If you just type in Gulag, you'll see Solzhenitsyn and also the book itself. So case studies is basically looking at a person over a long period of time. When we look at the naturalistic observation, for example, we are naturally observing people in their natural habitat. A good example there is Jane Goodall, where she spent a career communing and living in a community with chimps and primates, better understanding them. And much of what we know about chimp and primate behavior is known through her work exclusively. And I believe she's still alive and she still interacts with them. Another thing that we have to consider is ways in which we conduct research, and is typically qualitative and quantitative ways to conduct research. When we look at qualitative research, it basically means that we're looking at data, we're using open-ended questions, and we're looking for unstructured answers from the responding completing it. Now, you could also imagine if this is going to take place during interviews, maybe audio recordings when you're interviewing people, and it sounds almost like a journalist, right? So you have open-ended questions, unstructured answers, and you're trying to measure those answers qualitatively, looking for quality answers and trying to understand how to actually do such things. Quantitative research basically means that you are using measurements or psychometric instruments that are usually on a Likert scale, 1 through 5, 1 meaning least like me, 5 meaning very much like me, or maybe you're using a scale on the psychometric scale that goes from 1 to 7. And then the middle point would be kind of like the neutral area. That would be quantitative, because what you're doing there is you're basically having people complete a structured questionnaire or a scale instrument, and then you're going to quantify their answers, and you're going to use statistical formulas to put it into perspective. My particular study was a quantitative study, and I used statistical formulas to answer the 3 research questions that I put together. And I used a multiple regression analysis. And in the first ANOVA equation that I used to answer question 1, I wanted to know if I looked at the constructs or variables of grit, EI, and life status, well, grit, EI, and also 2 demographic variables, age and gender, to determine the relationship with life satisfaction. And what I found is that the answer was R.32. That basically simply means that the predictive variables of grit, EI, and the two demographic variables account for 32% of life satisfaction. And that's important to know because life satisfaction is a very complicated subject, but at least I know that those variables account for it 32% of the time. The second research question used a correlation coefficient for the predictors, and it found that EI was the one variable that was highly significant to measure life satisfaction. And then when I ran the stepwise basically does like a backward and forward type of analysis through a statistical program called SPSS. And it basically found that EI, or emotional intelligence, was statistically significant in its relationship in predicting life satisfaction. So we know, well, what I found in my study is that emotional intelligence is a good predictor of life satisfaction. And although grit is not as statistically significant by itself the way EI is, you put it together and it kind of enhances life satisfaction. So that's where I came to the understanding that if we can improve one's grit and also improve EI components, and there's typically 5 of them when you measure it on a scale using a psychometric instrument, you can improve the overall degree that people feel more satisfied in their life. And I think that's what most people like me, and I think most people are hoping for. So quantitative research is really important, and you'll also find that in survey research, which is what I was explaining with the psychometric instruments that we tend to use. Now, when we use descriptive studies, we might actually look to see if we can answer one variable. In this case, it's going to ask, how do people flirt? Now, again, how people flirt might be different than what the scientists are looking for. But once you know what you're looking for, then the coders are skilled in observing and recording when they see some type of flirtation. And it could mean something like this. Maybe you know a girl is interested in some type of flirtation when she plays with her hair. Could also mean maybe she's uncomfortable and she wants to run. But you got to try to figure. That was good. I just lost my train of thought. Maybe it was a Freudian slip to some degree. All right, so then we have the case study. We have observations, surveys, interviews, and we're using qualitative research to better understand this particular question on how people flirt. And then what is the best use for this kind of research? And it's going to tell us what it might aim to predict with a research question. So to start describing observed flirtation observation. But again, you have to know what you're looking for because your idea of flirtation might be different than the way the observers are trying to measure it. And it might not be consistent, so that's very important. Now, there is a downside to descriptive studies, and what it means is that the hypothesis or the testable prediction cannot be tested. What this really means is that you can't identify a cause or an effect relationship. You're just describing what you see. But the reason that this is important because if you get an understanding of what flirtation might look like for both male and female, you move in a direction where you can then start doing a different type of study that goes beyond description, and maybe you're running a correlational study, or maybe you start to run an experiment, and a whole nother set of rules start to apply at that point. And that comes to a correlational design. So you have a correlation coefficient, and what this basically means is you want to see if some of the variables that you are investigating are moving in the same direction or if they're moving in inverse directions. So as an example here, when you're looking at a correlation coefficient, the highest score that you can get is a 1. The lowest score you can get is a 0. A perfect 1 is rare. A 0 is rare as well. Don't be misled by positive or negative. A positive 7.5, a positive 0.75 is the same as a negative 0.75. Here's where it's different. When you have two variables moving in the same direction, it's positive. When you have two variables moving in the opposite direction, it is inverse, so it's going to be negative. An example of a positive relationship would be height and weight. The taller we get, the more weight we will carry on our skeleton, right? We expect people to weigh more as they get taller. That would be a positive correlation between both height and weight. An example of a negative correlation would be drinking alcohol and motor abilities. The more you drink, the more likely it is that you become intoxicated, and you'll notice that your motor ability changes. You also start to slur your speech. So those two variables would move in opposite directions. If you have a 0.25, for example, whether it's negative or positive, it would be a weak relationship. If you have a 0.5, negative or positive, it would be moderate. If you have a 0.85 or a 0.75, negative or positive, it would be considered strong. And that's what they do with correlational studies. They're measuring the strength using a correlation coefficient to understand it. Correlational studies tell us that there's a relationship. My study was a correlational study. And what that means is that I cannot say that a person's life satisfaction will be dictated by grit, cause and effect. A predictor like grit or a predictor like emotional intelligence does not tell me whether or not the outcome variable of life satisfaction is going to occur. Cause, effect. What it does tell me is that there's a relationship between those constructs, but it also tells me that when you measure it by itself, only emotional intelligence is really going to determine whether or not somebody is truly satisfied in their life. Make a little bit more sense? And that's what you do in correlational research. You're trying to understand the strength of the variables when measured together and whether or not the variables are moving in opposite directions. So if somebody's drinking a lot of alcohol, you know that eventually you will slur your speech, and eventually your judgment will deteriorate and you'll make poor decisions. So we know that drinking alcohol causes our thinking and our motor abilities to go in opposite directions, right? So keep that in mind. So cause and effect cannot be measured with that. So in a correlational study, you want to know basically, is X related to Y? X tends to be the predictor. Y tends to be the outcome variable. And you want to know if you can predict Y if you knew what X was, which means you have to start to look at very specific predictors in order, and test them, of course, in order to determine if there's a relationship there. Going back to the flirtation question, then you start to determine, are there differences between the way men and women flirt with one another? What do you guys think? Yes? I think so too. We could use a questionnaire. We're not going to be able to manipulate anything, and we're not going to be able to determine cause and effect. Women, I'm going to ask you, are you confident 100% of the time when you think a guy is flirting with you? Give me a clap if you are. Give me a clap if you think you're accurate more times than you're not. And give me a clap if you're a woman that has no idea when a guy flirts with you. Mixed group, right? So, take it like this. There's different perceptions, and I think, there is some truth that women do flirt differently than guys. And I do think that women have a pretty good understanding when a guy is flirting with them. And obviously from the audience, the clapping at certain questions reveals that. Now let's look at why correlation is not causation here. Now, it says here hairiness, which is going to be X, and aggression is going to be Y. So predictor and then the outcome. The predictor, which is X, is hairiness, and the aggression is Y. So the hairier you are, the more aggressive you're going to be, I suppose is what this is saying. But that doesn't mean that hairiness causes aggression. There could be another variable that we haven't considered yet. And what they find, according to a study in 2001, is that testosterone, which would be the Z variable, is the cause for both hairiness and also aggression. So the dotted arrow at the bottom is basically saying that there's a correlation between hairiness and aggression. But it doesn't give us cause and effect. And when they drill down on this even further and they investigate now testosterone levels, they find that certain levels of testosterone produce both hairiness and also aggression. Interesting, right? So when you run correlational studies, they're not going to be able to reveal cause or effect, but they are less cost. There's less cost associated with running a correlational study when measured against an experiment. And that leads us to the experimental design. If we run an experiment, we have a couple of things here. We have an independent variable. We also have dependent variables. Independent variables are like the predictors. The dependent variables are like the outcomes. Yes?
Just remind me again, what does the Y stand for? The X is the prediction variable, and the Y would
The Y is going to be the outcome.
Okay.
And the X is going to be basically the predictor. Okay? So in an experiment, when we're looking at these variables and we're trying to decide what is the independent or dependent variable going to be, we would say, okay, independent is going to be the predictor. The dependent variable is going to be the outcome that we're measuring. And then we're also going to need to randomly assign participants to both the control and also the experimental group. The control group is going to be the control group is important because it's going to be the group that does not get the treatment. The experimental group is going to get the treatment. So the independent variable is going to be the variable that is manipulated under controlled conditions. The dependent variable is the outcome or response. Let's go with a real study. It's no longer in the book, but it was like 3 or 4 textbooks back. Let's use Viagra. Prior to Viagra becoming commercialized as the little blue pill that allows some men that have impotence to experience erectile dysfunction, experience erections, and we'll refer to this study with ED instead of erectile dysfunction. What happens is you have a pharmaceutical company, and they're in their boardroom, and they're trying to determine what is a problem that we can focus on, and what drug can we create to cure this issue. Well, as men approach middle age, and while they're in middle age, they're more likely to experience ED. Give me a clap if you understand that. As a result of that, they're trying to come up with a solution to allow men to take a pill so they don't have the problem called ED. They ran a study, and if my memory serves correctly, the study had 240 people in it. As you can imagine, you're not going to have a population of men in there that are age 20. Because that population typically does not experience it. Although there is some evidence that watching too much pornography can actually cause ED eventually. But nevertheless, you're going to focus on a population of middle-aged men. So let's just say that we're focusing on a population of 45 to 55 years of age, as an example. I don't remember the exact age in the study. That's why I'm saying that. And what they do is they take a group of men that are middle-aged, and a group of men that have reported ED, and a group of men that don't have ED. And they put them in, no, actually I got that wrong, I apologize. I was thinking about something else at the same time. They take a group of men that have ED, and they assign them to both the experimental group and also the control group. The experimental group in this study is going to be the guys with ED that are given the drug called Viagra. and the group in the control group that is going to be given a placebo. And it's probably blue as well, but it has no effect. And then what they're going to do is they're going to make sure that there are certain features built into the study to make sure that there's no confounds that can cloud the data. And what does that mean? It means that when you have a nurse or a researcher administering the drug to the independent variable or the experimental group, you're not going to say you're getting the real thing. And the reason that that's important is because if they knew what they were getting, it could cause the results to be clouded. And I'll give you an example. Let's just say that we have a nurse, and the nurse knows which one is Viagra and which one is the placebo. And you've got the guy in the control group that's going to get the placebo, an inert sugar pill. And he says to the nurse, "You don't understand. I really need the Viagra. Please don't give me the placebo." If she knew which one was which, could she potentially manipulate the results unintentionally because she feels bad for the guy? Yes. So there needs to be, at minimum, a single blind study. But in this case, there should be a double-blind study. The double-blind study basically says that the person administering it and the person receiving the Viagra or the placebo does not know which is which. That way you cannot cloud the data. So in an example like I just said, maybe the nurse turns around and says, "Look, I feel for you, I really do. I would like to give you the real stuff. I don't know which one's which." They don't tell that to us because it would falsify the data. So they don't know. Only the people that are on the back end know which one is which. I'm sorry, I can't help you. Now, what's interesting about this study as well is they found that the men assigned to the experimental group that received Viagra were more likely to get an erection when measured against the group of guys in the control group that were receiving the placebo. As a result of that, they knew the drug worked. And shortly after that, and after it went through, I'm sure, certain standards with FDA, it was launched to the public. And now today, men know that if they're experiencing ED, they can get the little blue pill called Viagra. And that's how it was launched to market. Now, here's an interesting finding.
They had no problem getting funding?
No, that is not what I was going to say. There was a small population of men in the study that received the placebo that were experiencing erections as a result of it. So then they realized it was psychosomatic. In other words, all in their head, all in their mind. We know in controlled sleep environments, when you wake somebody up in REM sleep, they're more likely to have an erection than when they're not in REM sleep. And sleep studies have confirmed that. So it's interesting that a small population of men receiving the placebo were able to have an erection. So what does this mean? They then talk to them and they tell them, you need to go for therapy because the issue is really in your mind. And then they would start getting counseling, and that's what the study provided. But for the men that did not fit that description, they truly knew when comparing it to the experimental group that received Viagra that the drug actually does what it was meant to do. And as I said before, that's why men use Viagra today, because it's been clinically tested and it's been shown to be a viable alternative to ED.